All right, you all seem to be ready. I'm going to start here today rather than at the front slide, but you remember that we are dividing our study in Revelation into several sections, mostly around the idea of the number 7. And so the first section that we have is 7 churches, followed by a section accounted for by 7 seals. And in the 7th seal, there was, and followed by 7 bowls. And then we finalized it with 1 new city, and maybe I'll find a 7 in there, but I still keep studying, and I haven't found it in that last section. So the last one is 1 new city. But right now we are driving perilously close to the 7th trumpet. Right? We have been in the middle of our study of the 7 trumpets. We started with the first 4 trumpets where we saw various plagues of natural disasters coming from the altar in heaven. We looked at those and we said that those appear to be the judgments generally that God sends upon mankind. They're 1/3 disasters, right? They're partial judgments. They're warning shots, if you will, similar to the first 4 seals. And then we saw in the 5th and the 6th trumpet, we saw similar to the 5th and the 6th seal. First, in the 5th, a distinction between the righteous and the wicked. In the 5th seal, the righteous were comforted, the dead righteous in particular, the martyred souls, whereas in the 5th trumpet, the wicked are tormented by the supernatural style locusts. In the 6th seal, we saw the language of judgment, in particular judgment that's typically used around nations as they are brought to an end, right? Their political dominion is brought to an end. But in the 6th seal, we saw it in the terms of earthquakes, mountains falling away, things like that. Whereas we saw the language of judgment in the 6th trumpet with the horsemen, the 200 million horsemen, with the similar to locusts, the horses had various powers of breathing out fire and brimstone and other such things, and killing 1/3 of mankind with it. I think I may be confusing my numbers here, but they killed a lot of people with it, and various breastplates of the riders, and it was an army of 200 million that was bound at the Euphrates, and so we have language of judgment in that case again. Now, the point of the first 6 seals and the point of the first 6 trumpets is a lead up. It's a lead up to give the appropriate amount of drama, the appropriate amount of anticipation for the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet. And in each case before that, the scripture stops for an interlude. Interlude is our chance to take a break from the theme that's been building in the seals or the trumpets, to step back and to have a thought or that may be along the lines of the theme, but it gives the reader a chance to step back, take a break, and in this case, in the vision in Revelation, the purpose of the break can be numerous things, whether you're talking a musical or a fine arts performance of some sort. But in this case, the purpose of the interlude is for the reader. It's for the hearer of the vision, of the prophecy, because these things are fairly dramatic. They're terrifying. You don't want to get caught up in it. You want to be remembering what's really happening. It gives a summary reassurance of who's in control and of who's going to come out good on the other side. And so we started our study Wednesday night. We had a special Wednesday session this week, and we started our study on this second interlude in chapter 10, and we went through why we have an interlude right now. The primary reason is there's been a lot of information, but the first 6 trumpets are terrifying, and the 7th trumpet is going to have the most terrifying thing in the whole book, right? And so right before we go into the 3rd woe, or the 7th trumpet, let's take a break and have this interlude to give reassurance to the reader, to the hearer, that our fate, our destiny, our position with God is secure, right? And that we're going to come out okay on the other side. So that was the purpose of the interlude. We noted here that in previous visions of this type, even Revelation, or even back in Daniel and Zechariah or wherever, you tend to have this pattern of, here's the vision, now here's the meaning of the vision. And we've seen it in a number of cases where Daniel will say, so I saw the vision, I sought to know what it meant, so I asked this angel who was standing by, or so this angel came to me and said, now here's the meaning of the vision. This is that, this is that, this is that, and you get a nice code. So there's not much question about what it is. This is one of the rare cases where you have a vision like this and you're not told the meaning. You don't have right after that, and here's the meaning of the vision. So we have to do a lot more work on our part to look at the symbols and to come to some sort of an understanding of what the Lord intends for us to get from these symbols. And on the other hand, since we're not told from heaven exactly what they must mean, we also must be the more careful about drawing our firm dogmatic conclusions about what these symbols mean. With that in mind, we looked Wednesday night at this idea of the vision. For those who haven't seen this, when you see these sort of pictures in here, this is the angel and this is John in this case. John looks that way every time. These are some of the pictures I pulled out from what's called the Bamberg Apocalypse, which is a lectionary that exists over somewhere in Germany that's got a number of 11th century drawings and readings from Revelation and whatnot. So I've just shamelessly copied them right out of Google Arts and used them for my purposes here. I'm going to say it's in the public domain, but I don't really know that. So this is the vision. This was the summary of the vision. There was a strong angel with a little book. Let's see, you know what? Let's go ahead and get the reading of this because it will do good to remember our text as we're about to go through it. Who will read for me chapter 10, verses 1 through 11? Go ahead.
I saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. He had a little book open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. He cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roars. When he cried out, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, seal up the things which the 7 thunders uttered, and do not write them. The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised up his hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, and the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be delay no longer. But in the days of the sounding of the 7th angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God will be finished, as he declared to his servants and the prophets. Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, go, take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth. So I went to the angel and said to him, give me the little book. And he said to me, take and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth. Then I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth, but when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And he said to me, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings.
All right, thank you. So this is the study that we did Wednesday. First, when we looked at the key elements of the vision, you got the strong angel in the little book, right? Then there are peals of thunder. John doing his job that he's been told to do, writing things down, but he's told about these peals. Whoa, stop that. Don't write those peals of thunder down. And we don't know why. So we don't know. The angel swears, hey, there's not going to be any more delay. In the days of the 7th trumpet, the mystery of God will be finished. John eats the book. It's sweet in his mouth and bitter in his stomach, as he was told it would be. And he is told that he must prophesy again. So there's no question about these things. This is just what the vision said happened. This is what happened, right? The question for us is, what meaning are we supposed to take from the symbols, right? And we've got to be careful in approaching it. And this is, 10 and 11 are one of the hardest chapters in Revelation to really try to interpret well. Because it's not explained. So here are some key symbols that I think we need to understand. This is what we looked at Wednesday, as I said. You have to really understand the prophetic work of Ezekiel, I think, to understand just how parallel this section is to Ezekiel's prophetic work, right? You have to have a really good understanding of that book. In particular, the eating of a bittersweet message. That's your easy key. That's your easy key to say, I've heard about this sweet as honey in the mouth, but bitter before. That's your easy key to say, maybe I should go back a little and look at where that came up. And that's in Ezekiel. It's in Ezekiel chapter 2 and verse 9 through about chapter 3. He also was given a book in the throne scene in front of God. that came to him, he was given a book that was written inside and out, and on it were written a message of mourning, lamentation, and woe, and he was told to eat it, and when he ate it in the vision, it was sweet as honey in his mouth. Now, it doesn't say that it was bitter in his stomach, but he got bitter after that, and the fact is that it was a message of mourning, lamentation, and woe. So there's your bitterness, right? But it's sweet because it's the Word of God. You know what God wants. It's God's revealed Word. Right? So that says, maybe I should go back and look at Ezekiel. So we did that. We did that Wednesday night. A message of judgment for the wicked, but sealing the righteous. That's similar to what John is doing in Revelation and what Ezekiel had to do. It was an idea of there's going to be tribulation here, but the people of God will be sealed. God knows who are his. Right? It was in an apocalyptic vision in the same way. It was a message concerning peoples and nations and tongues and kings. First, in 25 to 32, against the nations that existed at that time. Tyre, Sidon, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Egypt in particular. Ezekiel prophesied against. But then as you get to 38 and 39, it's against these nations called Gog and Magog, which are somewhat symbolic for all the nations of the Gentiles, right? And in particular, it was looking forward to his future kingdom, these future peoples that would war against the people of Christ. So that had been prophesied about by Ezekiel as well. Then there's this idea of the symbolic measuring of the sanctuary of God. We haven't read it here. We're about to read it in the first part of chapter 11 as John goes out with a staff is given to him and he's told to go measure the temple. Well, that's exactly what happened for 9 chapters in Ezekiel when actually the angel takes a rod and starts measuring everything around Jerusalem and Judea, temple and gates and places and whatnot. And Ezekiel is charged with writing down the dimensions of all of them. And you read it and you're like, why is he doing this? Because none of these dimensions are real. None of them match. And in Israel's history, they never were that. The point was growth. The point was it's going to be bigger, and that gets fulfilled in the kingdom, in the church, as everything is bigger than just the little nation of Israel. It's all the peoples coming to God through Jesus Christ, right? And so you're going to have this same symbolic measuring of the sanctuary of God. I'm putting out there my opinion. Now, every commentator notes that, hey, that's a little bit like Ezekiel in eating the bittersweet message. And they all reference back and say, that reminds us of that. But I think they stop a little short, I think, of getting the whole thing. And I think what's happening here is that in this idea of you must prophesy again, or prophesying again, John is taking up the role of Ezekiel. He's the second coming of Ezekiel in this case, in this section, right? He's saying, just like you prophesied before, Ezekiel, and now John, and taking his place, you're going to have to go prophesy again about tongues and kings and nations and such things. And I think the message that follows in chapter 11, or the prophecy that follows, is that prophecy, that prophesying again. But it could be referring to the rest of the book, or the message of the whole book, because the book as a whole really continues Ezekiel's message. But I think in particular it's looking at chapter 11 in this interlude with this summary. And the reason I think this is prophesying again has to do with taking up the role of Ezekiel is John has not prophesied like this before, right? And you might say, Patrick, John's an apostle. Surely he prophesied. Agreed. Surely he did. But in this major sort of things to come in the future, apocalyptic type, what is the other one I'm missing? Apocalyptic type, literary prophecy type of role. This is a first for John. What have his other messages that you've read been about? What has John had a revelation type of book before this one? What are his letters typically about? Yeah, what Jesus did, how you ought to live, right? Traditional, hey, by the way, you should walk in the light, right? Kind of things. Yeah, that's what they're about. But as far as taking up this role, this is a first for John. And also it has to, the other reason I think that is, we don't have any record that John somehow, after that, and what most people think is, well, John's going to go out and do another, some level of great prophecy going around all the countries of the world. Well, probably not. Even if it's in the 60s when this is written, John's still old. And if it's in the 90s, he's beyond old. I don't think this is what's being referenced anyway about what John is going to have to go do. This is in the vision. And so the rest of the vision is that prophesying again. He's taking on the role of Ezekiel. I think the symbols are strong enough to suggest that. The only thing that I think I haven't covered and won't in my slides here is this idea of, well, what does it mean when the mystery of God is finished in the days of the seventh trumpet, right? I think that, and again, we don't get this section of this means that, right? So I'm doing my best with the symbols here. I think what that means is the last thing chronologically that any of the Old Testament prophets prophesied about was what? But I'll go a little beyond that. You're in the right prophet, though. Because there's a little bit beyond the destruction of the Jerusalem. What did we say Wednesday night? We're going to be introduced to the beast in a little bit, and that takes us back to what chapter in the Old Testament? Daniel 7, right? At the end of Daniel 7, you also have the prophecy about the Roman persecution of Christians, and how when that is finished, though, the kingdom will be with Christ forever and with his people. I think this may be that. That's the last thing that his servants, the prophets, I think that's the phrase in here, right? Where is the mystery of God is finished in here? I'm looking. Verse 7, the mystery of God is finished as he preached to his servants, the prophets. I think that might be what it has to do. But it also may just mean, we're going to wrap up this prophecy, right? Within the seven seals were seven trumpets. Within the seven trumpets will be, the end of this. The mystery of God will be complete. We'll complete this message. Could be that too. Could be either one of those. Okay, I am good with 10:1 to 11. We covered that, and we covered that Wednesday. Any other thoughts or questions before we move into the prophecy and cover some new ground in chapter 11? All right, let's cover some new ground then. We also read, and then had to stop there, in chapter 11. This is a continuation of the same interlude. And now, I think what's happening is John has eaten this book, and now I think what we're getting here is the prophecy that is that little book that he got, right? And it will be still in the interlude, so it's still in summary form. Let's get the next reading of 11, verses 1 through, 13. Who's got it? Joshua?
Then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, "Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar, and those who worship in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And I will grant authority to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows out of their mouth and devours their enemies. So if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. These have the power to shut up the sky, so that rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every plague. And often as they desire, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them, and overcome them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified.
Did you say in the great street, or street of the great city?
Street of the great city.
Okay, very good. Keep going.
Those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days, and will not permit their dead bodies to Those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God came into them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell upon those who were watching them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." Then they went up into heaven in the cloud, and their enemies watched them. And in that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven.
All right, very good. So as we said Wednesday, as we were just closing this up, one of the hardest ones to try to interpret because the symbols are numerous. They're just throwing symbol after symbol after symbol at you, and they just kind of start to weigh you down as you're trying to keep up with how do I understand this, right? And in particular, since that doesn't give you what the meaning is. So you really got to work hard at it. It's been my sort of practice so far in this study to say, this is what Haley says, this is what McGigan says, this is what Ogden says, this is what Walvard says, this is what Hendrickson and Williamson say. For this section at least, I'm mostly just going to give you what I think as the result of the study. And then you can ask me questions, or I might put in a blurb here about what someone thinks. But I'm mostly going to give you what I think this is coming to, and then we can poke holes in it if we like, right? So this is the prophecy, right? These are the key elements of the prophecy. John is told, measure the temple, leave out the court. That is, don't measure the court. I'm not concerned with it because it's been given to the Gentiles. They'll trot it underfoot for 42 months. Authority is going to be given to my 2 witnesses to prophesy. I said prophecy, it should say prophesy. Authority is going to be given to my 2 witnesses to prophesy. Now, who are these 2 witnesses, you say? Well, that's easy. They're the olive trees and the lampstands, and I didn't put it up here, they're also in sackcloth, and they have, if somebody tries to hurt them, they can send out fire from their mouth, or they can prevent rain, and they can turn water to blood, and they can do all these plagues. And as you're looking at these, the symbols of each one of these are overwhelming, because each one of these brings up a specific person to mind. While it doesn't necessarily say it specifically, when I look at the sackcloth and ashes, to me that says John the Baptist. The idea of, and maybe I had it in the notes here. No, I'll come to it. We're just getting the elements of the prophecy first, and then we'll come back to the meanings. The beast will kill the 2 witnesses. That's what happens next. They have lots of power, but at some point, the beast, who we're, by the way, first being introduced to here, the beast who comes out of the abyss will kill the 2 witnesses. John says it as though you know who that is, but he hasn't said anything about this beast in Revelation yet. He'll very much introduce it later, right, and develop it, which sort of gives me the idea that he understood that people aren't going to get this prophecy the first time through. They'll be introduced to this beast later. They'll have to come back and look and think about this. But also, we have been introduced to this beast in Daniel 7. So they would have been familiar with this beast, though they don't know which one he's talking about yet. But he's going to kill these 2 witnesses. Their bodies are going to lie in the street of the great city, which has a few names. The peoples, the evil peoples, the Gentiles, they're going to celebrate, right? We killed the witnesses, ha 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 ha. And witnesses will then, after that happens for a couple days, they're going to be resurrected, caught up to Jesus, and glorified there with him. So they'll be vindicated for what they've gone through. And then there'll be a great earthquake that destroys 1/10 of the city and kills 7,000. Okay, these are the elements of the prophecy. Now we search for meaning, right? Well, let's look at some key symbols. Measuring the temple, leaving out the court. What does that mean? I think simply it means God knows who are his, right? We've seen this idea of his people being sealed before. In the New Testament, what is the temple of God? It's the church. That's what's to be measured. God needs to know its characteristics. He wants it measured because those are his. Leave out the court. Those people aren't part of this, right? And so they're sealed and protected in spirit, though they will have tribulation in the world. They are sealed, they are his. This 42 months, and we'll see it We'll see it a few times. We see it here. I think we may have even seen it already at some point here. But 42 months, and we certainly saw it in Daniel. 1,260 days, times and a half a time. It's all the same thing, right? Each of these is a descriptor of 3.5 years. That's what that is. That's what that time comes out to. But symbolically, it's important to notice that it's half of 7, right? It falls, it's short of. It's specifically not God's complete 7. And so symbolically, we feel pretty confident in the idea that this is a limited time of limited earthly tribulation. It's something that the Christian can count on, maybe unpleasant, but will come to an end, right? And we are familiar with this idea in our earthly struggles, in our earthly toils. We go through hard times, and invariably, they what? They end. They come to an end. They get better, right? And we have our ups and downs. But this is the idea there, okay? Now, here's the tough part. The 2 witnesses. First off, why are there 2? A lot of people note this, and I think this is the best idea. The idea of 2 here in a book that's full of number symbols, I think is this idea of confirmed testimony, right? Now the Bible will typically say by 2 or 3 testimony is to be confirmed, but 2 seems to be the number of full witnessing. Somebody get for me Deuteronomy 19:15, and somebody get for me, so who's going to do that? Who's going to get for me Deuteronomy 19:15? Caleb. And who's going to get for me John 5:31 and 32? Room full of people. Larry. Yeah, go.
One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established.
Right, and so this is in the giving of Israel's civil law, right? When somebody comes before the court with a matter and they say, hey, I want to accuse somebody, do you accept the accusation coming from one person? No, in fact, later, what would Paul tell Timothy? I think it was Timothy, it might have been Titus, but I'm pretty sure it's Timothy. Yeah, he says, don't take it from one person, right? So it's the same thing. It's this idea of, we've got it, we're going through it right now in some of the letters I've sent you about something that's going on in Uganda where one person accused another person, right? And we got to think about, well, what do we do? Do we accept the accusation of one person who's since come back and said, no, I didn't do that? Okay. So, but, this is kind of our rule. You don't accept the accusation from one person. It's got to be confirmed by a second witness, right? Let's talk about that in Jesus' case. Jesus sort of lives by this rule. He understands this rule. He understands he can't just come and bring his own testimony about himself. Go ahead with your reading, Larry.
If I alone testify about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who testifies of me, and I know that the testimony which he gives about me is true.
All right, and in that section of John, Jesus actually gives, several witnesses, right, of his testimony. John the Baptist, the Scripture, the works that he's doing, right? So he's got at least 4 witnesses there when you add himself, and I haven't reviewed it lately, but, he's sort of laying out, this is the principle. You got to have 2 witnesses to count a thing as true, right? When he sent the disciples out on the limited commission, how did they go? And so this is a well-established, well-known scriptural principle. And by the way, what are these guys called? Witnesses. Testimony of 2 is the truth, right? So that's what I think the symbol is there. Now, in particular, they get a lot of descriptors, right? They're clothed in sackcloth, which we all know very well is representative of mourning, humility, and repentance. I think, I'm thinking about this phrase that Jesus said about John the Baptist. I think that symbol sounds like John the Baptist to me, but I don't know for sure. He is not said to have worn sackcloth. What is he said to have worn? Yeah, camel's hair. That sounds like sackcloth to me. but it's not. So I'm stretching with this part. But with these next ones, I'm not stretching. The two olive trees and the lampstands, there's no question where that comes from. That's only one place in the Old Testament. That's in Zechariah. That was the vision given to Zechariah about these olive trees and lampstands, and the numbers were a little different there, but we're doing two here because we're doing witnesses. But in Zechariah, it was Joshua the high priest, and it was Zerubbabel, the son of David, the one in line as the leader, as the king, as the governor, who was standing before the Lord. Zechariah was saying they're going to be established. We have this idea here of in 1 Peter 2:9, where we learn that we are a royal priesthood, and that was those two roles, and that was what was being shown was going to be in one place. Fire comes from their mouth, devouring the enemies. I've put the scripture reference here, but you should know who that is. Who had fire? Who, when he said something, fire came out and devoured his enemies in front of him? By the way, it's going to be the same guy who did that, preventing rain. It's Elijah. It's Elijah. Those two things are Elijah. Okay, good. Now we've got water to blood and plagues of the earth. There's only one person who that is. That's Moses, right? And so, I'm trying to figure out, what are all these things? And I think the answer is, and by the way, they're killed by the beast at the conclusion of their testimony. That's going to bring you back to Daniel chapter 7. Then they're resurrected and glorified. I think this is the answer. Some of the guys I was reading sort of came along with this as well. I think McGigan and Haley largely, but I really like this answer. These witnesses are the saints coming out of the Great Tribulation, right? That those who testify about Jesus. And there's another reason I like this. What have we been seeing as parallel, these seven trumpets and the interlude here? What have we really been pointing out the parallel to? They're parallel to what? The first six trumpets and the interlude are parallel to what? Or at least the first six trumpets are parallel to what? What have they looked a lot like? The six seals, right? Yeah, I knew what you meant. They looked a lot like the six seals. This interlude looks a lot like the interlude that we had in between the sixth and the seventh seal. Now remember back to that one, that was the 144,000 sealed on earth from the tribes of Israel. And then all of a sudden they were in heaven, and a numerous multitude in white robes singing to the Lamb and to the one on the throne. And at that point, the angel pointed out, or somebody pointed out to John, he said, "Who are these in white robes?" And he said, "Lord, you know." And he said, "These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation. And they have these robes, and they are before God because they have their robes washed in the blood of the Lamb and because of their faith in Jesus." Right? And because of that, they're before God. He spreads his tabernacle over them. There's no longer any heat from the sun. There's no longer any tears. They serve him, and everything is good. Right? So you first had this idea of tribulation on earth, right, with the 144,000, that you find out are going through, it says, the Great Tribulation. And then you have this idea of glorification for that number in heaven, right? And I think that's what's happening here as well. The church, whose primary job on earth is to do what? What is our primary job on earth? What do we do? There may be two or three answers you can give to this. I'm going to wait till I get the one I want. To witness to Jesus. Is that not what we do? We are the ones who give the testimony of Jesus. And the whole book of Revelation has been about that, right? The testimony of Jesus. Faithful perseverance in the name of Jesus. That's what these two witnesses are. And so all these Old Testament symbols together, I think, are saying it's not any one person, but rather these are the people of God who witness and testify of the words of God, and in particular about Jesus. The idea that they then are, that they're well known to God, and in fact God, for all these people, God stood up when people came against them and stopped those people from destroying them, didn't he? Did Moses get destroyed by Pharaoh? It's an easy answer. Okay, no, there we go. Did Elijah get destroyed by Ahab? No. Did Zerubbabel and Joshua get destroyed by their circumstances of the world and the nations surrounding them and making them little? No, they didn't. And in the same way, God protects his church, he protects his saints, and yet you see that on earth we have tribulation. And in fact, for these people who are going to be going through the Great Tribulation, it will result in many of them, though God knows them in the same way he knew Elijah and Moses and Zerubbabel and Joshua, though he knows them in that same way, it will result in their what? On earth. What will it result in? What will this Great Tribulation result in? No, first, their death. Yes, then victory. Then they'll be resurrected and glorified, right? And it will be found that the Great Tribulation didn't stop them at all. Okay, you can poke holes in that, and then I'll and then I'll talk to you about maybe a little bit about what some other people say about this this section. Any thoughts or questions or comments or whatever you got? I've been doing most of the talking. Go for it, Larry.
In the first verse, 11:1, my New American Standard, and this may not have any relevance to anything.
Well, let's see.
But I just wonder, whenever someone speaks, it's usually it's either identified as Christ himself speaking or an angel.
Yeah.
But my New American Standard says someone said. It doesn't say. It doesn't identify who that was.
No, and in fact, I was.
That puzzles me.
I was reading something similar as I was studying ahead today in 14, and it happens on occasion. You're right. Most of the time it says the angel said, or this one said, or the elder said, or whatever, but not always. And so usually when it's a voice from heaven that's unnamed, which seems to be the case here, it wouldn't be the beast or this is a message from heaven being given to John, right? When it's an unnamed voice, where the source is God, right? Whoever's, even if he may not be the one speaking, but it's heaven's will being made known. In this case, it's the unnamed heaven's will is being made known. Or they may have translated it wrong, and it's meant to be the angel said. You know, it's tough to know. But it's certainly saying he got a message from some heavenly sort of authority that said, do this.
But apparently, whoever said this, it was not important for us to know who it was.
Correct.
It's not
Correct.
something
That's right. Okay? Anybody else? Okay. Some other things that people say. And then I'm going to get into this idea of the great city. Do I want to cover the great city first, or do I want to say what other people say first? I think I'll cover the great city first. That's a section here that I didn't really cover. I talked about the significance of the witnesses, but if you look in verse 8, and their bodies, the witnesses, will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically, or your footnote might say, or spiritually, or the idea there might be symbolically, is called, this great city is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Now, I'm going to give you some options for understanding what that great city is. But first, this is a real quick look. I'm sure you can all read that from wherever you're sitting, right? I'm sure I've got at least 4 people here who can read it here in the front. But these are just the uses of this idea of anytime you see great city in Scripture. Now, not all of these say the great city, but several of them do. The first use of it is found back in Genesis chapter 10, where the earth is sort of being distributed after the flood, and the nations are moving about where they're going, and you find out that it's this city Rezin between Nineveh and Calah that is the great city. I think it ends up becoming Nineveh, because Nineveh will later be referenced as the great city, right? In Joshua, Gibeon was a great city. Doesn't seem to have the idea in mind. In Jeremiah, this has to do with Jerusalem. Why has the Lord done this to this great city? In Jonah, it's talking completely about Nineveh, right? And it has the definite article. Go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it. Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and proclaim to it. Jonah arose. Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3 days' walk. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city, right? And then you don't see the term great city again till right here in Revelation chapter 11, right? Most of it has to do with Nineveh, which is a symbol for what? Yeah, which is also a symbol for what? What was Nineveh to the people of God? Yeah, the great oppressor, right? So whether that is meant to carry that through, it's tough to say. And then the rest of it is in Revelation. Now, one thing is true for certain. Whatever the great city is here, it's going to be Babylon later in the vision. That's what it is here. There's not another great city in Revelation. It's the great city. So it's going to be called Babylon in the rest of Revelation. That's what the great city is in Revelation. So we still have some options for understanding what's the great city, right? Here's our options that I've come up with. You might have other options as well. The city is Jerusalem and is being compared to Sodom and Egypt. Now, why might we say it's Jerusalem? Yeah, because it says, where also their Lord was crucified. This is in particular I'd say this is probably the anchor hold of his entire thesis for Mr. Ogden, the commentator, who centers the book of Revelation around the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not his only point, but it's his center point. He's looking at that and he's going, well, that's Jerusalem and there's no way it's anything else, right? It's hard to say that he doesn't have a good point there or that he's wrong, in particular because that's where Jesus was crucified, right? Here's another option. The city is Rome and is being compared to Sodom and Egypt and Jerusalem, right? That's an option. Here's a third option. The city is Rome. It's compared to Sodom and Egypt, and it's also being accused of its part in the crucifixion of Jesus in this case. Remember, this is a symbolic city in a vision. It's the great city, right? In a vision. So you can do that in a vision. You can symbolically speak of their part in Jesus' crucifixion as where their Lord was crucified. There also won't be just two witnesses that get crucified or that get killed in the middle of the great city, whatever it is, right? It's a vision. Okay. And for that, you can see Acts 4:23 to 31, where Peter and John give the reference to this idea of there were many kings and Gentiles gathered here against your Christ and his servants, and yet you stood up for them and made yourself known, he would say. Okay, so and here's a fourth option. This one is in particular for Mr. Haley. It's the only place I found it. It's this idea of the world city. It's the great city of the world, in particular as you find in Isaiah 24 to 27. And going back and looking at that, Isaiah 24 to 27 is a real interesting place because it is really an unnamed city of the world is what's presented there and how God will judge it, how God will do things. It's also the section where God tells you, I'm going to get rid of the veil that's been over all peoples. And that veil is death. And he's going to take it away. So God's speaking in these dramatic terms in that case. It's also where he says, by the way, I'm going to crush and destroy Leviathan in those days, which we come to understand as Satan, in particular pictured as a dragon, which happens here. So this he goes back to the same saying. It says, it's the city of the world. And Sodom and Egypt kind of go with that. These are all the oppressors of God's people, those who gather themselves against the cause of God. Okay, so we got four options. There's any number of crazy other options, but these are four good options. I have to choose one of these two. Because as I'm reading the whole book, I'm not able to see any way that the whole book is about the destruction of Jerusalem. It doesn't fit. It doesn't fit for me in the whole. And so for me, I have to take one of these two because I know later Babylon is going to be Rome. That's where Mr. Ogden is going to miss it, I think, because he's going to say Babylon is Jerusalem, and Babylon is just not Jerusalem. Babylon is Rome. So for me, it's got to be one of these two. And he could say I'm wrong too. That's fine, right? If I have to choose right now, I choose this one because I think that makes more sense to me symbolically in the vision. This idea of Rome is and the great city is getting credit for her part, and she's identified there with these other great historical, licentious, evil people and oppressors of God's people in Sodom and Egypt, right? But this idea that Haley has actually it goes real well if you kind of fold it in here and give Rome their part. So that's where I land at there. This is what all the people said. I don't think you can cover that. And then we would get into the next section. Okay. What do other people say about this section? Let me see if I can read this. Haley says the great world city thing. He's largely in line with what I've said here. That I think in this first part. Citizens of this world say he's more along the lines of things being against the unregenerate world. McGigan is pretty close to what I've said. Hendrickson, remember, he's from the Reformed background, and he starts talking about a short period. He starts thinking at things that are still going to happen in the future from today, just before the end of the world. He's not premillennialist, but he says just before the end of the Christian dispensation, you're going to see sort of the church destroyed as a powerful missionary institution. You'll only have the individual witnesses left. Ogden, we've talked about. He believes the beast is the Roman Empire. But he emphasizes the role of Elijah and Moses there, and he says this is the law and the prophets laying dead in the street of Jerusalem as Rome is closing in on them. And he says the earthquake is many thousands literally dying at the fall of the temple as recorded by Josephus. So he goes in between figurism and literalism sort of when he wants. I do that too, I guess. Yeah, it's hard not to. Walvard is our token premillennialist. The beast is Satan. The two prophets are two literal prophets that are going to come in the future that are going to have these literal powers, and they will do these things, and everyone will stop them. And then their literal two bodies will be dead in the streets, broadcast by television across the world. The whole earth will look at them, and then there'll be a literal earthquake in Jerusalem that literally kills 7,000 people, right? So that's where he comes from, and I've already expressed my opinion. Okay, thoughts about chapter 11, and this is the conclusion of the interlude here. I still get you guys for another 6 minutes here, right? But so I'm going to introduce the seventh trumpet. But other thoughts here? Or questions? Or I went too fast and you say, well, explain one more thing to me. In summary, for 10 and 11, John is taking on the prophetic work of Ezekiel, right? He gets this message of mourning, lamentation, and woe, this great tribulation that the saints are going to have to go through, and this prophecy is going to be about that. The two witnesses are symbolic of the church on earth, the saints, as we testify about Jesus. We are sealed in God. We have all the power we need to defeat the enemy that we have, and that's true in Jesus. We have all the power we need to defeat our real enemy, but our lives here may sometimes be subject to Satan's will. We can be killed here, but we can be confident that we'll be resurrected and glorified by the power of the one who we've come to testify about. Okay, that's the summary. Larry, you had a thought now.
In verse 4 here, the two witnesses, the olive trees and the lampstands.
Yeah, huh?
I was reading in one of the commentaries. I can't even tell you which one now.
That's okay.
But
You can play stump the teacher. I'll see if I can get it.
what he was saying was which is produced by these olive trees,
Sure.
and of course put into the lampstands, was their source of light.
Yep.
And so that's what this is representing.
Absolutely. And that's how.
We know that God is light.
And that's how it was in Zechariah as well. That's the olive tree. Normally they would take the olives, get the oil from it, and then put it in the lampstand. In Zechariah, the olive tree fed directly to the light, to the lampstand.
That's why this terminology is used here, the olive tree and the lampstand.
Yep, they go together.
Represents the light.
That's exactly right. Okay? Yes, Andrea?
I have no idea. I had written in my margins, I had somebody teach
Okay.
in the past that the 42 months was that Christ was being taught in Jerusalem for 3.5 years. As the 42 years and 20 days.
Yeah, I'm going to say, I don't know if somebody that taught you that was close to you, so I want to be careful what I say about that, right? But I'm going to go on a limb and say that's wrong. The 42 months is just so closely tied to the 1260 days, the times and a half of times. It almost just has to be this idea of the temporary time of tribulation. Ogden makes this mistake as well. He tries to make the 42 months into the time of the time of the siege, or the time of the Jewish war as a whole. And it's you just can't make the 42 months into something literal, because it's used interchangeably with these other sets of numbers, and it's been used as far back as Daniel as well.
But would you agree that the destruction was 70 AD, and that Titus is actually picking up the war of his father, who started actually about 3 years before that? So, I mean, there really is a time period that Ogden is, I think he made a lot of sense. I
Yeah.
appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, I've read a couple parts about that. The problem is there you get to pick and choose what event you start from and what event you stop at and what section of it, right? Yeah, and yeah, it's right around 42 months in that particular case, but I think it's too noticeable that this terminology shows up throughout different parts of the book and the scripture, is this idea of temporary tribulation, and in particular that it's half of 7. So it's not that it's stupid. It's not stupid, but I feel much more strongly about the other option that we have of it's this idea of partial tribulation on earth. And there was some question about that. I saw in Ogden's book that he said it was this many months from here to here, and then I think I read, I think in McGigan, that somebody had said that some other commentator had said something similar, but he said, but it isn't really, because if you look at this and then you look at, and if you're going back that far, historical records from then are really hard to get to the month, right, of exactly what happened, because who really knows what really happened in the communication by boat. So that's what I'm thinking. Okay? I have a few minutes left to introduce to you the 7th trumpet, and we'll see how far I want to get here. Okay, you recall that after the 4th trumpet, we had an eagle, possibly an angel, depending on which translation you get and who was right about how to translate it, flies across mid-heaven and says, "Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth," 3 woes, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound, right? And then at the end of each trumpet, we see, and in fact we see, if you look at chapter 11, verse 14 here, the 2nd woe is past, behold, the 3rd woe is coming quickly. That's not to say that what's been before has been part of the 6th trumpet. It was an interlude. It's to reset your mind of what we were talking about. Oh yeah, we were talking about the 5th and 6th trumpet and these 3 woes, right? So there were 3 trumpets left, and they're identified independently as 3 woes. We had the 5th one. It was these locusts, right, that torment men, I think in particular evil men, for 5 months, right? The 6th one was these horsemen that shoot things out of their mouth and kill people that are bound up at the Euphrates, the 200 million of them. That's the second woe to those who dwell upon the earth. That one is past. It says the third woe is coming quickly. So remember, we're still looking for this third and or seventh trumpet, depending on how you're counting it. Third woe, seventh trumpet. And our question should be, as we're approaching it now that we're done with the interlude, what is the third woe to those who dwell upon the earth? That's what we have to keep in our minds as we get ready to go into the seventh trumpet. We've seen two woes to those who dwell on the earth. It has to be those who dwell on the earth. It's been said a number of times. We should be looking for, in the next section, the identification of what's the third woe to dwell on the earth. Now, this is really the substance of the vision now, just to let you know as we get into that. Remember this idea of these things are shortly to come to pass from chapter 1. These things are shortly to come to pass. And we said that doesn't mean everything that's ever mentioned is in the future and just the immediate future, but it means the substance of the book, the substance of the vision is shortly to come to pass. I'm going to tell you here, this is now, we're approaching the substance of the vision. I get the feeling that we may have had some frustration with the idea of, Patrick, we've had these seals and you said they're generic judgments. And we've had these trumpets and you said they're generic judgments. You didn't want to tie any of these first 4 seals or any of these first 4, or even in some cases first 6 seals and trumpets to specific things from history or in the future, right? You said this is how God deals with people. It's a symbolic, it's judgment in the symbol, in the vision, leading up to the 7th. So I've been generic, right? Now we're coming to the substance of the vision with the 7th trumpet. We're about to get very specific. This is the woe. This is the reason we've had to have interludes to stop all along the way and say, remember who's on the throne. Remember who's in charge now and what he did to get there. Remember that he knows who you are. Remember that you persevere and your reward will be there waiting for you. It's because of what's coming in the third woe. We've been getting the people ready to take this information. And with that, I'll say thank you for your participation today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next class.